The knock came so faint against the thick wooden door that Franklin Thorne almost missed it over the howling wind that tore through the Montana Territory mountain pass. But something made him pause mid-stride, his hand hovering over the iron poker he'd been reaching for to tend the fire. It was January of 1876, and this winter had proven itself the harshest Franklin had witnessed in his 32 years. The last 8 of which he'd spent alone in this cabin he'd built with his own hands high in the Bitterroot Mountains. He wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody in their right mind would be traveling through this wilderness tonight, not with the temperature having dropped so low that his breath crystallized the moment it left his lips, even inside the cabin with the fire roaring. The knock came again, stronger this time but still weak, accompanied by a sound that made his chest tighten with concern. A woman's voice, barely audible, calling out something he couldn't quite make out through the thick logs. Franklin moved quickly despite his size, his 6'3" frame crossing the cabin in 3 long strides. He yanked open the heavy door, and the wind immediately tried to rip it from his grip, sending a blast of snow and ice into the warm interior. On his doorstep, illuminated by the golden light spilling from inside, stood a woman so covered in snow she looked like a ghost. She was swaying on her feet, her lips blue, her dark eyes barely focused, and before Franklin could say a word, she collapsed forward into his arms. He caught her instinctively, feeling how light she was, how cold her body felt even through the layers of frozen clothing. Franklin kicked the door shut behind him and carried her immediately to the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, laying her down carefully. His mind raced through everything he'd learned about treating exposure to extreme cold from the old trapper who taught him to survive these mountains. He needed to warm her gradually, get the wet clothes off, wrap her in something dry and warm. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Franklin said, his deep voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. Her eyes fluttered but didn't fully open. He could see her shivering violently now, which he knew was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still fighting. He'd seen men who'd stopped shivering and they'd never made it. Franklin worked quickly, pulling off her frozen gloves to reveal delicate hands that were frighteningly pale. He removed her snow-caked cloak and the layers beneath, trying to be as respectful as possible despite the emergency, leaving her in her undergarments and immediately wrapping her in every blanket and fur he owned. He built up the fire until it roared, then filled a pot with water to heat, knowing he'd need to give her something warm to drink once she came around more fully. As he worked, he found himself studying her face. Even pale and unconscious, she was beautiful in a way that made his breath catch, with high cheekbones, full lips, and long dark hair that was plastered to her head from the melted snow. He guessed she was in her mid-20s, though it was hard to tell in her current state. What he couldn't figure out was what in God's name she was doing alone on this mountain in the middle of the worst blizzard of the winter. Franklin rubbed her hands gently between his own much larger ones, trying to restore circulation. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, her eyes finally opened fully, and she looked up at him with confusion and fear. "You're safe," Franklin said immediately, his voice calm and steady. "You're in my cabin. You knocked on my door, do you remember?" She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to process everything. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Franklin reached for the cup of water he'd prepared, now warmed, and helped her sit up slightly, supporting her back with one arm while he held the cup to her lips with his other hand. "Slow sips," he instructed. "Not too fast." She drank obediently, and after a few sips, her voice finally worked. "My horse," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "He threw me when lightning struck near us. I tried to find him, but the storm got worse. I walked for hours. I saw your light through the trees." Franklin felt a surge of respect for her. To have survived hours in this cold took remarkable strength and will. "You're very lucky you found me. There's nothing else for miles in any direction." "Lucky," she repeated, and something in her tone made him think she didn't feel very lucky at all. She closed her eyes again, exhaustion clearly overwhelming her. "Rest," Franklin said, laying her back down gently. "We'll talk more when you're stronger. Right now, you need to let your body recover." He stayed beside her through the night, monitoring her breathing and color, adding wood to the fire, making sure she stayed warm. He dozed in his chair occasionally but never deeply, always alert to any change in her condition. By dawn, some color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing had become deeper and more regular. When she woke fully the next morning, the storm was still raging outside, and Franklin was cooking breakfast over the fire, filling the cabin with the smell of bacon and coffee. She stirred under the pile of blankets, and he immediately turned to check on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, crouching down beside her. "Warmer," she said, and this time her voice was stronger. She looked around the cabin, taking in her surroundings properly for the first time. It was a simple but well-built space, with a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom. Everything was neat and organized in the way of a man who lived alone and had created his own order. Shelves lined one wall, filled with supplies and tools. A large bed occupied one corner, and she realized she was lying on furs in front of the fireplace. "Thank you for saving my life." "Franklin Thorne," he said, offering his hand, "and I'm just glad I heard you knock." She took his hand, noticing how it completely engulfed her own, how warm and strong it felt. "Rachel Templeton," she said. "Most people call me Rachel." "Rachel," Franklin repeated, liking the sound of it. "Are you hungry? I imagine you haven't eaten in a while." The mention of food made her stomach growl audibly, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Franklin just smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face, softening the hard edges that came from years of living alone in harsh conditions. He had a strong jaw covered in a thick beard, deep-set gray eyes that seemed to see right through a person, and brown hair that was shaggy and in need of a trim. Everything about him spoke of strength and self-reliance. He brought her a plate of bacon, beans, and hardtack, along with a steaming cup of coffee, and helped her sit up against the wall so she could eat properly. Rachel realized she was ravenous, and she ate quickly, barely tasting the food in her hunger. Franklin sat across from her, eating his own breakfast and giving her space, not pushing her with questions even though she could see the curiosity in his eyes. When she'd finished, she wrapped the blanket more tightly around herself and finally met his gaze. "I suppose you're wondering what I was doing out there." "Only if you want to tell me," Franklin said. "It's none of my business." But Rachel found herself wanting to tell him. There was something about Franklin that felt safe, trustworthy. Maybe it was because he'd saved her life, or maybe it was the gentle way he'd cared for her despite his rough exterior, but she felt she owed him an explanation. "I was traveling from Helena to meet my brother in Missoula," she began, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "He's a schoolteacher there, and he'd arranged a position for me as well. I was supposed to travel with a family who was making the journey, but at the last moment, they postponed their trip by a week. I couldn't wait because the school term was starting, so I decided to go ahead on my own. I know it was foolish, but I'm a good rider and I thought I could make it. In January, through the mountains." Franklin's voice held no judgment, just genuine confusion. Rachel felt defensive despite herself. "I didn't have much choice. I needed this position. My brother pulled strings to get it for me, and I couldn't let him down. I'd been traveling for 2 days, and everything was fine until yesterday afternoon when that storm came out of nowhere. Mountain weather can turn faster than a rattlesnake striking, Franklin said. Even experienced trappers get caught out sometimes. You're not the first person to underestimate these peaks. But I should have known better, Rachel said, her voice breaking slightly. I grew up in Montana. I know how dangerous winter travel can be. I just thought I had to prove something, I suppose, that I could take care of myself, that I didn't need anyone's help. Franklin was quiet for a moment, then said, "Well, everyone needs help sometimes. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Something about those simple words made Rachel's throat tighten with emotion. She blinked back tears, frustrated with herself. She'd worked so hard to be independent, to not rely on anyone after her father died 3 years ago and left her and her brother to fend for themselves. Her mother had passed when Rachel was young, and she'd always been the one taking care of things, managing their household, making sure everything ran smoothly. The idea that she'd nearly died because of her own stubbornness was almost too much to bear. "Hey," Franklin said softly, and she realized tears were sliding down her cheeks. He moved closer and handed her a handkerchief. "You survived. That's what matters. You found help when you needed it, and you had the strength to keep going until you did. That takes courage." Rachel wiped her eyes, embarrassed by her display of emotion in front of this stranger, but Franklin didn't seem bothered by it. He just waited patiently for her to compose herself. "How long do you think the storm will last?" she asked, changing the subject. Franklin moved to the window and looked out at the white wall of snow. "Hard to say. Could be another day or two, maybe more. These January blizzards can settle in and just stay. But don't worry about it. I've got plenty of supplies, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need to." The thought of being stranded here with this strange man should have worried Rachel, but oddly, it didn't. There was something about Franklin that put her at ease despite his size and isolated life. He was gentle in his movements, careful in his speech, respectful of her space. She'd met plenty of men in her 26 years, and she'd developed a good sense for which ones were dangerous. Franklin Thorne, for all his rough mountain man appearance, didn't register as a threat. "I don't want to impose," Rachel said. "You must value your privacy, living all the way up here alone." "I do," Franklin admitted. "But that doesn't mean I'm not willing to help someone in need. Besides, it's been a while since I had someone to talk to. I go into town maybe 3 or 4 times a year for supplies, and other than that, it's just me and the mountain." "Don't you get lonely?" Rachel asked, then immediately felt embarrassed by the personal question. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't pry." "No, it's all right," Franklin said, returning to sit by the fire. "I do get lonely sometimes, but I left the world below for reasons, and up here, life is simpler. Harder in a lot of ways, but simpler. You know what you're dealing with. Animals weather the land, it's all straightforward. People are more complicated." Rachel heard something in his voice, some old pain, and she wondered what had driven him to this isolated existence. But she didn't push, just as he hadn't pushed her for her story. They settled into a comfortable routine over the next 2 days, as the storm continued to rage outside. Franklin gave Rachel his bed, insisting that she needed the rest and comfort more than he did, and he made himself a bedroll near the fire. Rachel protested, but he was immovable on the subject, and eventually she gave in, too exhausted to argue further. She spent much of the first full day sleeping, her body recovering from the ordeal. When she was awake, Franklin kept her fed and comfortable, and they talked in brief spurts about inconsequential things: the weather, the mountains, life in Helena where she'd been living. Franklin was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions and seeming genuinely interested in what she had to say. By the second day, Rachel was feeling much stronger and insisted on helping around the cabin. Franklin tried to convince her to rest more, but she was stubborn, and he quickly learned that arguing with her was pointless. She took over cooking duties, and Franklin had to admit that her stew was considerably better than anything he usually made for himself. She also tidied the cabin, organizing his supplies in a way that actually made more sense than his previous system, though he'd never admit that out loud. As they worked together in the small space, Rachel found herself increasingly aware of Franklin's presence. He moved with a surprising grace for such a large man, and she noticed details about him she'd missed in her initial exhaustion. The way his hands were scarred from years of hard work, but were always gentle when he handed her something. The low rumble of his laugh when she made a joke. The intelligence in his eyes when he talked about the mountain and its patterns. He might live like a hermit, but he wasn't simple or uneducated. He'd clearly had a life before this one. On the third morning, Rachel woke to silence. The wind had finally stopped. She sat up in the bed and saw Franklin already awake, standing at the window. "Storm's over," he said without turning around. "Snow's deep, but the sky's clear." Rachel felt an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief because she could continue her journey to her brother, but disappointment because it meant leaving this warm cabin and the surprising comfort she'd found in Franklin's company. She got up and joined him at the window. The world outside had been transformed into a pristine white landscape, with snow piled several feet high in drifts. The trees were heavy with it, their branches bowing under the weight. The sun was just rising, painting everything in shades of pink and gold. "It's beautiful," Rachel breathed. "That it is," Franklin agreed. "Deadly, but beautiful." They stood there together for a moment, and Rachel was acutely aware of how close he was, how she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She'd been wearing his spare shirt and trousers since her own clothes were still drying by the fire, and she felt small and strange in the oversized garments. "I'll need to look for your horse," Franklin said, breaking the moment. "Or at least find some sign of what happened to him. Then I'll take you down the mountain to the nearest town. There's a settlement called Taylor about 15 miles west of here. Small place, but they've got a trading post and a few houses. Someone there can help you get to Missoula." The practical words brought Rachel back to reality. Of course, he wanted to get her back to civilization. He'd already done more than enough by saving her life and hosting her for 3 days. She was an interruption in his solitary life, and now that the storm was over, it was time for things to return to normal. "Thank you," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice light. "I'm grateful for everything you've done. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "No repayment necessary," Franklin said gruffly. He moved away from the window, and Rachel immediately missed his warmth. "Let me make breakfast. Then I'll gear up and go look for that horse." Franklin headed out an hour later, dressed in layers of furs and carrying snowshoes to help him navigate the deep drifts. Rachel watched from the window as he disappeared into the white landscape, feeling strangely anxious about him being out there alone, which was ridiculous given that he'd been doing this for 8 years without her worry. She used the time alone to change back into her own clothes, which had finally dried. They were worn from her ordeal but serviceable. She packed her few belongings into her saddlebag, preparing for the journey down the mountain. As she worked, she tried not to think about how much she'd missed this cabin, how safe she'd felt here, how much she'd enjoyed Franklin's steady presence. It was late afternoon when Franklin returned, and Rachel's heart leaped with relief when she saw him approaching through the trees. He was alone, though, and she knew what that meant before he said anything. No sign of the horse. Franklin confirmed as he stomped snow off his boots at the door. "I found tracks from a few days ago that might have been him, but they disappeared where the snow got too deep. He either made it to lower ground or he didn't survive the cold. I'm sorry." Rachel nodded, feeling sad about the horse but also resigned. She'd known it was unlikely he would have survived. He was a good horse. I hope he found shelter somewhere. Franklin pulled off his outer layers and moved to warm himself by the fire. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow. It'll take most of the day to get to Taylor, so we need to start early. The snow's going to make it slow going." That night, their last night together, Rachel and Franklin sat by the fire talking longer than they had before. There was an unspoken awareness that this was ending, that tomorrow they would part ways and likely never see each other again. And it made them both want to stretch out the time they had left. Franklin told her about how he'd come to the mountain. He'd been a soldier during the Civil War, fighting for the Union, and he'd seen things that still haunted him. After the war ended, he tried to return to normal life in Ohio where he'd grown up, but he couldn't settle. Everything felt too crowded, too noisy, too full of memories. He'd heard about the Montana Territory from a fellow veteran, about the wide open spaces and the chance to start fresh. So he'd come west, worked as a trapper for a few years to learn the skills he needed, then built this cabin and created a life of solitude and peace. "Don't you ever want to be part of the world again?" Rachel asked. "To have a family, friends, a community?" Franklin was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I used to think I didn't," he said finally. "I used to think I was done with all of that I'd seen too much and been through too much to ever fit back into normal life. But lately, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just hiding up here instead of actually healing." His honesty surprised Rachel, and she felt honored that he would share something so personal with her. "I think healing takes as long as it takes," she said softly. "There's no right or wrong way to do it. If you need solitude, there's no shame in that. What about you?" Franklin asked, turning to look at her. "What are you running from? Or is it something you're running toward?" Rachel considered the question. "Both, maybe. I'm running toward independence, toward proving I can take care of myself, but I'm also running from the memory of my father's disappointment. He wanted me to marry well, to be taken care of by a proper husband. Instead, I insisted on getting an education, on working, on being more than just someone's wife. We fought about it constantly in the last years of his life, and I think he died believing I was going to end up alone and unhappy." "Are you unhappy?" Franklin asked. "No," Rachel said, then reconsidered. "Or at least I wasn't. Now I'm not so sure. I've been so focused on being independent that I haven't let anyone get close to me. I've kept everyone at a distance, afraid that if I let someone in, I'd lose myself somehow. But these past few days, being here with you, it's made me wonder if maybe I've been going about things wrong." The air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Franklin held her gaze, and Rachel could see a war happening behind his eyes, want battling with restraint, hope fighting with fear. "Rachel," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "if circumstances were different, if I was different, I would ask you to stay." Rachel's heart pounded. "What if I want to stay anyway? You don't know what you're saying. You don't know me, not really. You have a life waiting for you, a position at a school, your brother expecting you. You can't throw that away because of a few days in a cabin." "Can I?" Rachel challenged. "My whole life I've done what was expected of me, what was sensible and practical. Maybe it's time I did something just because it feels right." Franklin stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair in agitation. "It wouldn't be fair to you. This life, it's hard and lonely and isolated. You'd grow to resent it, to resent me. You deserve better than a broken-down soldier hiding from the world." Rachel stood as well, moving closer to him. She was small compared to his size, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but she felt fierce and certain. "Don't I get to decide what I deserve? Don't I get to choose what I want, Rachel?" Franklin said again, but this time it came out almost like a plea. She could see him wavering, see the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack. "I'm not saying I'll stay forever based on 3 days," Rachel said, her voice steadier now. "I'm just saying give me a chance to know if you could be what I've been looking for. Let me stay a while longer. Help me see if I'm strong enough for this life." Franklin looked down at her, and Rachel could see the moment he surrendered. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his large hands. His touch was warm and slightly rough, and Rachel leaned into it instinctively. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. "Then don't," Rachel whispered back. "Don't push me away because of fear." Franklin lowered his head slowly, and Rachel rose on her tiptoes to meet him. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, both of them testing this new connection between them. But then, Franklin made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that made Rachel's knees weak. She gripped his shirt to steady herself, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fabric, and kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past 3 days. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said simply. "At least through the winter. See if you can stand it here, stand being with me. Come spring, if you want to leave, I'll take you wherever you need to go, but stay and let's see what this could be." "Yes," Rachel said, feeling joy bubble up inside her. "Yes, I'll stay." They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation in it, just pure rightness. Rachel had made snap decisions before, but none that felt as absolutely correct as this one. She knew her brother would worry when she didn't arrive in Missoula, but she would send word somehow, explain that she was safe and had chosen to stay in the mountains for the winter. He wouldn't understand, but that was all right. This was her life, her choice. The winter months that followed were the happiest of Rachel's life. She and Franklin fell into a rhythm together that felt as natural as breathing. She learned how to survive in the wilderness, how to track animals in the snow, how to recognize which plants were safe and which were dangerous, how to predict weather changes by reading the sky and the behavior of birds. Franklin was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for not knowing something, always encouraging her to try again when she failed at a task. In turn, Rachel brought warmth and life to Franklin's solitary existence. She filled the cabin with her presence, her laughter, her stories, her songs. She could see him slowly opening up, becoming more talkative, smiling more often, letting go of some of the darkness he'd carried for so long. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing their histories, their dreams, their fears. They learned each other's bodies slowly, reverently, discovering a physical connection that matched the emotional one growing between them. By the time February arrived, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with Franklin Thorne. She loved his quiet strength, his gentle hands, his thoughtful silences, his rare but beautiful smiles. She loved the way he looked at her like she was precious, the way he listened when she talked, the way he held her at night when the wind howled outside. She loved the life they were building together, simple but rich in ways her previous life had never been. One evening in late February, as they lay together in bed with the fire burning low, Rachel gathered her courage and said the words that had been building inside her for weeks. "I love you, Franklin." She felt him tense slightly beneath her, and for a moment she feared she'd spoken too soon, pushed too hard. But then he rolled to face her, and in the dim firelight she could see his eyes shining with emotion. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick. God help me, Rachel. I love you more than I thought I could ever love anything. You've brought me back to life." They made love then with a tenderness and passion that left them both shaken, clinging to each other afterward like they were afraid to let go. Rachel knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. This mountain, this man, this life was hers now, and she'd never been more certain of anything. When spring finally arrived in late April, bringing with it melting snow and the first green shoots of new growth, Franklin asked Rachel to marry him. It wasn't a fancy proposal, just the two of them sitting on the porch he'd built watching the sunset, but it was perfect. He gave her a ring he'd carved himself from a piece of elk antler, intricate and beautiful, and when Rachel said yes, she saw tears in his eyes for the first time. They married in Taylor, the small settlement 15 miles from their cabin. The preacher there was happy to perform the ceremony, and several of the townspeople attended, curious about the mountain man and the woman who'd chosen to live with him. Franklin cleaned up well, Rachel discovered, trimming his beard and wearing the one set of good clothes he owned. She wore a simple blue dress she'd made herself from fabric Franklin had gotten on his last supply run, and she felt more beautiful than she ever had in the fancy dresses from her previous life. After the ceremony, they stopped by the trading post so Rachel could send a letter to her brother. She'd written to him several times over the winter, explaining her situation and her choice, but this letter was different. This one told him she was married, that she'd found her place in the world, that she was happier than she'd ever been. She hoped he would understand, even if he didn't approve. As they rode back up the mountain toward home, Rachel riding behind Franklin on his horse, she felt complete in a way she never had before. She'd spent so much of her life trying to prove she didn't need anyone, trying to be independent and self-sufficient, but she'd learned that true strength wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about choosing who to be vulnerable with, who to build a life with, who to love. The first years of their marriage were filled with hard work and deep contentment. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room that could serve as a workroom for Rachel's sewing and Franklin's carpentry projects. They planted a garden that first spring, and Rachel discovered she had a talent for growing things. They got chickens, and later a milk cow, building up their little homestead. Franklin taught Rachel to shoot, and she became proficient with both rifle and pistol, able to defend herself in their home when he was away hunting. She proved to be a natural shot, something that surprised them both. Together they hunted deer and elk, and Rachel learned to preserve meat for the winter months. She made soap and candles, cured hides, gathered wild herbs for cooking and medicine. The work was endless and exhausting, but it was also satisfying in a way her previous life never had been. They made the journey down to Taylor several times a year, trading furs and herbs for supplies they couldn't make themselves: flour, sugar, coffee, cloth, ammunition. The townspeople grew to know them, and while some thought they were crazy for living so isolated, others admired their self-sufficiency. Rachel made friends with several of the women, and though she didn't see them often, she cherished those connections. In the spring of 1878, 2 years after they'd married, Rachel discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been certain until she missed her second monthly cycle. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She knew that having a baby this far from medical help was risky, but she also knew that women had been doing it for centuries. She had Franklin, she had her own strength, and she had the knowledge she'd gained from books and from talking to other women in Taylor. When she told Franklin, his reaction was everything she'd hoped for. He swept her up carefully in his arms, joy and fear warring on his face, and held her close. "We're going to have a baby," he whispered against her hair. "Rachel, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, even though she could see that he was. "Happier than I have any right to be," Franklin said. "But I'm also terrified. What if something goes wrong? What if I can't protect you both?" "We'll be fine," Rachel said with more confidence than she felt. "Women have babies in the wilderness all the time. We'll prepare as best we can and we'll face whatever comes together." They spent the summer preparing. Franklin built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving animals on the sides: deer, elk, bears, eagles. Rachel sewed tiny clothes and blankets, making them soft and warm. They stocked up on extra supplies when they went to tailor, and Rachel talked at length with the two women in town who'd recently had babies, learning everything she could about what to expect. As her belly grew through the summer and into fall, Rachel felt more connected to the world around her than ever before. She would sit on the porch in the evening, Franklin's hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for this life they'd built. Yes, it was hard and sometimes lonely, but it was also rich with love and purpose. The baby came in early December, during a light snowfall that made the world feel hushed and magical. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Franklin stayed by Rachel's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, offering her sips of water, encouraging her when she was certain she couldn't go on. When their son finally arrived, crying lustily and waving tiny fists, Franklin cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped him carefully in a soft blanket before placing him in Rachel's arms. Rachel looked down at the red-faced, perfect little creature they'd created and felt love so fierce it took her breath away. "He's beautiful," Franklin said, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Rachel. You're amazing." They named him Thomas, after Franklin's father, who died when Franklin was young. Little Thomas proved to be a strong, healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. He nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, and both Franklin and Rachel fell completely in love with him. Those first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. Franklin was a devoted father, taking on more of the household tasks so Rachel could rest and recover. He would walk with Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in his deep voice that always seemed to soothe him. Rachel would watch them together and feel her heart expand with love for both of them. As Thomas grew from an infant into a curious toddler, the cabin rang with his laughter and chatter. He was fascinated by everything around him, from the chickens in their coop to the way snow fell from the trees. Franklin made him toys: a rocking horse, wooden blocks, a small bow and arrow set. Rachel taught him his letters and numbers, and made up stories to tell him at bedtime. In 1881, when Thomas was 3, Rachel gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Rachel's mother. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with Franklin's brown hair and Rachel's hazel eyes, and she was born more easily, arriving in just a few hours one spring morning. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and he took his role as big brother seriously. With 2 children, life became even busier. The cabin felt small sometimes with all of them, but it was a comfortable kind of crowded, full of warmth and love. Franklin built bunk beds for the children's room, and Rachel sewed curtains and made rugs to make the space cozy. They were a family now, complete and happy in their mountain home. Rachel's brother, Edward, finally visited them in the summer of 1882. He'd written regularly over the years, their relationship slowly healing from the initial shock of Rachel's choice. But he'd never made the journey to see them until now, when he had a break from teaching and finally admitted to being curious about the life his sister had chosen. Edward was shocked by how remote they were, but he was also impressed by what they'd built. He saw how hard Rachel worked, but also how happy she was. He saw Franklin's devotion to his family, the way he looked at Rachel like she hung the moon. He played with his nephew and niece, charmed by their intelligence and spirit. By the end of his 2-week visit, Edward had to admit that Rachel had found something special, even if it wasn't a life he would choose for himself. "You were right," he told Rachel the night before he left, sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "You knew what you needed better than any of us did. I'm sorry I doubted you. You were just worried about me," Rachel said, squeezing his hand. "I understand that, but you can see now that I'm happy that we've built a good life here." "I can," Edward agreed. "Franklin is a good man." "You chose well." Those words meant more to Rachel than Edward probably realized. She'd never regretted her choice to stay with Franklin, but having her brother's approval felt like a final piece clicking into place. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. In 1883, a harsh winter killed half their chickens and their milk cow, and they had to make do with less until they could rebuild their livestock in the spring. In 1884, a late freeze destroyed most of their garden, and they had to rely more heavily on hunting and the supplies they could get from Taylor. But they weathered every challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame. Franklin proved to be an excellent father, patient and loving with the children while still maintaining discipline. He taught Thomas to hunt and track, to read the forest and understand the language of animals. He taught Margaret to carve and whittle, delighted to discover she had a talent for it. He never raised his voice in anger, never lifted a hand to them, determined that his children would never know the harsh discipline he'd experienced as a child. Rachel taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic, using old school books she'd had sent from Helena. She taught them about plants and herbs, about cooking and preserving food, about the practical skills they'd need to survive in this environment. But she also made sure they knew there was a wider world beyond their mountain, reading them stories of faraway places, teaching them about history and science and art. In 1886, when Thomas was 8 and Margaret was 5, Rachel discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, leaving her exhausted and sick for months. Franklin worried constantly, hovering over her until she had to shoo him away. But in early 1887, their 3rd child arrived safely, another boy they named Henry. He was the biggest of their babies, with a shock of dark hair and a calm temperament that made him easy to care for, even when Rachel was still recovering her strength. With 3 children, the cabin was definitely too small. That summer, Franklin and some men from Taylor that he'd hired worked to expand it significantly, adding 3 small bedrooms and a larger main living area. It took most of the summer, but when it was done, they finally had enough space for their growing family. Rachel cried with happiness the first night they all ate dinner in the new, larger space, looking around at her husband and children, and feeling overwhelmed with gratitude. The children grew up strong and capable, as comfortable in the wilderness as they were with books and learning. Thomas became an expert tracker and hunter, able to move through the forest silently and read signs that Franklin sometimes missed. Margaret developed her father's skill with woodworking, creating beautiful carved pieces that they were able to sell in Taylor. Henry, as he grew, showed a gift for music, somehow able to make songs from anything. A willow whistle, a stretched hide drum, his own voice. In 1891, when Franklin was 47 and Rachel was 41, they celebrated 15 years of marriage. They'd weathered so much together. Brutal winters, scorching summers, injury, illness. the constant challenge of living so far from civilization. But they'd also experienced more joy than Rachel had thought possible. The love they shared, the family they'd created, the life they'd built with their own hands. That anniversary evening, after the children were asleep, Franklin and Rachel sat on their porch watching the stars come out, something they'd done countless times over the years. Franklin took Rachel's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the familiar way that still sent warmth through her body. "You ever regret it?" Franklin asked quietly. "Staying here with me instead of having an easier life?" Rachel looked at him in surprise. "Never, not even once. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. I just want to make sure you know how much you mean to me," Franklin said, turning to face her fully. "You saved me, Rachel. I was barely living before you knocked on my door that night. I was just existing, going through the motions, hiding from the world. But you brought me back to life. You gave me a reason to be more than just a man alone on a mountain. You gave me love, family, purpose. Everything good in my life comes from you." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. Even after 15 years, Franklin could still move her with his words. "You saved me too," she said softly. "I thought independence meant being alone, that needing someone made me weak. But you showed me that real strength is letting someone in, choosing to build a life with someone. You've given me more than I ever dreamed of having." They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 15 years of love and partnership and shared struggle. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Here's to 15 more years," Franklin said. "And 15 after that," Rachel added. And however many were blessed with beyond that. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new experiences and changes. Thomas, at 16, started talking about wanting to see more of the world beyond their mountain. He loved his family and the life they'd built, but he also felt the pull of curiosity about what else was out there. Franklin and Rachel understood, even though the thought of him leaving made their hearts ache. They'd raised their children to be independent thinkers, and they couldn't fault Thomas for wanting to explore. In 1893, Thomas left for Helena, planning to work and see something of city life. It was hard for all of them, especially Margaret, who'd always been close to her older brother. But Thomas wrote regularly, and he came home for visits, and slowly they all adjusted to him being gone most of the time. Margaret, at 14, showed no interest in leaving. She loved the mountain life, and had started talking about eventually building her own cabin nearby when she was old enough. Maybe finding a husband who would be willing to live in the wilderness. Franklin wasn't sure how he felt about that, thinking of his daughter with a husband. But Rachel just laughed at his protective instincts and told him they had time before they needed to worry about it. Henry, at 10, was still young enough that his future was unclear. He had his music and his love of the forest, and he was happy helping his parents with the daily work of maintaining their homestead. He had a gentle nature that reminded Rachel of Franklin, and she suspected he would grow into a kind, thoughtful man. As Franklin and Rachel entered their 50s, they started to slow down a bit, though they were still active and healthy. Franklin's hair had gone mostly gray, and he moved a bit more carefully on cold mornings when his joints ached. Rachel's hair had silver streaks through it now, and she needed reading glasses for her sewing and letter writing. But they were content, satisfied with the life they'd built and the family they'd raised. In 1895, Thomas returned home with a surprise: a wife. Her name was Mary, and she was a sweet young woman from Helena who'd fallen in love with Thomas's stories of mountain life and wanted to see it for herself. Franklin and Rachel welcomed her warmly, delighted to see their son so happy. Thomas and Mary built a cabin about 2 miles from Franklin and Rachel's, close enough to be helpful to each other but far enough for privacy. It was good to have Thomas back on the mountain, even if he was no longer a boy but a man with his own life. Margaret, at 17, had indeed found someone who was willing to embrace mountain life. His name was Peter, a young man from Taylor who'd grown up hunting and trapping with his father. He'd met Margaret when Franklin brought her to town to sell her carvings, and he'd been smitten immediately. After a proper courtship, they married in 1896, and Peter proved himself to be a hard worker and a good match for Margaret's strong personality. They built their cabin on the other side of Franklin and Rachel's, creating a small family compound of sorts. Henry, at 14, was still at home but growing fast. He'd shot up in height over the past year and now stood as tall as his father. He helped Franklin with the heavy work around the homestead, and in the evenings he would play the guitar Franklin had bought him on a trip to Helena, filling the cabin with music that made them all feel peaceful. In the spring of 1897, Rachel's brother Edward wrote with sad news. He was ill with consumption and didn't expect to recover. He wanted to see Rachel one last time. Despite the difficulty of the journey and her own advancing age, Rachel knew she had to go. Franklin insisted on accompanying her, leaving Henry in Margaret's care, and they made the trip to Missoula where Edward was living. They arrived in time to spend 2 weeks with Edward before he passed peacefully in his sleep. It was hard for Rachel to lose her brother, the last connection to her old life, but she was grateful she'd had the chance to say goodbye. Edward had told her how proud he was of her, how he'd watched her build an extraordinary life, and those words stayed with her during the grief that followed. After Edward's death, Rachel found herself thinking more about the passage of time, about mortality and legacy. She and Franklin were both in their 50s now, and while they were healthy, they wouldn't live forever. But looking at their children, all grown and building their own lives at the homestead they'd created, at the love they'd shared for over 20 years, Rachel felt satisfied. They'd built something lasting, something meaningful. In 1898, Thomas and Mary welcomed their first child, a boy named Franklin after his grandfather. Franklin Sr. was overwhelmed with emotion when he first held his grandson, and Rachel had to laugh through her own tears at the sight of her tough mountain man husband turned to mush by a tiny baby. They were grandparents now, a new chapter beginning. That same year, Margaret also had her first child, a girl named Rachel. Having 2 grandchildren brought new energy to Franklin and Rachel's lives. They loved having the little ones visit, spoiling them in the way grandparents do, then sending them home when they were tired. It was a perfect arrangement. As 1899 turned into 1900, a new century beginning, Franklin and Rachel reflected on all the changes they'd witnessed. They'd lived through the end of the Wild West era, seeing Montana become a state in 1889, watching as civilization slowly encroached on the wilderness they loved. But their mountain remained largely unchanged, still wild and beautiful, still home. Henry, now 18, surprised them by announcing he wanted to go to school to study music. He'd been saving money from selling furs and working odd jobs in Taylor, and he'd applied to a music school in Denver. Franklin and Rachel were shocked but supportive, proud of their son for pursuing his passion. Henry left in the fall of 1900, and suddenly the cabin felt empty with just the 2 of them again. But being alone together again wasn't a bad thing. In many ways, it felt like coming full circle, back to how they'd started. They settled into a quieter routine, taking care of their homestead, visiting with their children and grandchildren, enjoying the peace that came with age and experience. On a cold January night in 1901, 25 years after they'd first met, A blizzard came through the mountains. As the wind howled outside, Franklin and Rachel sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, and reminisced about that first night when Rachel had knocked on his door half frozen and changed both their lives forever. "You remember how terrified I was when I opened that door and saw you collapse?" Franklin asked, his arm around Rachel's shoulders. "You remember how stubborn you were about me staying," Rachel countered, snuggling closer to his warmth. "You tried so hard to get rid of me as soon as the storm passed." "I was trying to protect you from making a mistake," Franklin said. "I never imagined you'd actually want this life." "Best mistake I ever made," Rachel said firmly. "Everything good in my life came from that one night, from finding your cabin, from choosing to stay. You've been my warmth through every season, Franklin, not just that first winter. In every hard time, every challenge, every moment of doubt, you've been there keeping me warm and safe." Franklin kissed the top of her head, emotion thick in his voice. "And you've been my light. You brought warmth and light into my cold, dark existence. I didn't even realize how much I'd shut myself off until you showed me what living actually meant." They sat there for a long time, listening to the storm outside, safe and warm together just as they'd been 25 years ago. The circumstances were different now. They were older, they had children and grandchildren. They'd built a life beyond anything either of them had imagined that first night. But the essential thing remained the same. They had each other, and that was enough. Over the next few years, their family continued to grow. Thomas and Mary had 2 more children, and Margaret and Peter had 3 more. Henry finished his studies in Denver but surprised everyone by returning to Montana, settling in Helena where he taught music and performed at various venues. He visited the mountain regularly, bringing his guitar and filling the cabin with songs. Franklin and Rachel aged gracefully into their 60s, slowing down but still active. They still maintained their homestead with help from their children, still went to tailor for supplies, still enjoyed their quiet life in the mountains. Their hair was completely gray now, their hands marked by years of hard work, their faces lined with the evidence of a life fully lived. In 1908, they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary and Rachel's 58th birthday. All 3 of their children came home for the celebration, along with their spouses and all 7 grandchildren. The expanded cabin was bursting with people and noise and laughter, and Franklin and Rachel stood on their porch watching the chaos with deep contentment. "We did good, didn't we?" Franklin said, his arm around Rachel's waist. "We did," Rachel agreed, leaning into him. "We did real good." That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, various family members scattered throughout the cabin and the children's old houses nearby, Franklin and Rachel lay in bed together in the quiet darkness. "I love you," Franklin whispered, pulling her close. "Just as much now as I did that first winter. More, maybe, because now I know every part of you, all your strength and stubbornness and kindness. You're everything to me, Rachel." "I love you too," Rachel said, her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat. "You've given me a beautiful life, Franklin Thorne. I couldn't have asked for anything better." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the way they'd slept for 32 years, and dreamed of all the seasons they'd weathered together, all the warmth they'd shared, all the love that had grown from one desperate knock on a door during the coldest night. The years continued to pass peacefully. In 1910, Franklin was 66 and Rachel was 60. They'd lived in their mountain cabin for 34 years, longer than most people stayed in one place. The wilderness that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Rachel first arrived had become home in the deepest sense. Every tree and rock and stream familiar and beloved. They had 9 grandchildren now, with another on the way. Thomas was a skilled trapper and guide, taking people into the mountains for hunting expeditions. Margaret had turned her woodworking into a successful business, selling her pieces as far away as Butt. Henry was making a name for himself in Helena as both a teacher and performer, and he'd started courting a young woman who sang with a lovely soprano voice. Franklin's health began to decline slowly in 1911. Nothing dramatic, just the natural wearing down of a body that had worked hard for nearly 7 decades. He tired more easily, needed more rest, moved more carefully. Rachel fussed over him, making him sit while she did heavier tasks, insisting he see the doctor and tailor regularly. Franklin complained but let her baby him, secretly enjoying her care. In the spring of 1912, Henry married his sweetheart, a young woman named Grace, in a ceremony in Helena. The whole family traveled down for the wedding, and it was joyous to see all of them together, 3 generations celebrating. Franklin walked slowly now with a cane, but he was still sharp and present, dancing with Rachel at the reception despite his reduced mobility. On the journey back up the mountain after the wedding, Franklin and Rachel traveled alone, having insisted their children not worry about accompanying them. They'd made this journey hundreds of times over the decades, and they wanted one more trip that was just the 2 of them. They camped one night under the stars, and Rachel helped Franklin settle by the fire, wrapping him in blankets. "Remember when you used to be the one taking care of me?" Rachel teased gently. "Still would if I could," Franklin said, taking her hand. "Hate that you have to do so much of the heavy lifting now. Franklin, you took care of me for 3 decades. It's my turn now. Besides, I'm not doing anything you wouldn't do for me." "True enough," Franklin admitted. He looked up at the stars, bright and clear in the mountain sky. "You know, I never thought I'd live this long. After the war, I didn't think I'd make it past 40, but then you came along and gave me a reason to keep going, to want more years." "Every day with you has been a gift, Rachel." "Don't talk like you're dying," Rachel said, even though she knew that day would come eventually for both of them. "You've got plenty of years left." "Maybe," Franklin said, "but if I don't, I want you to know that I died a happy man." "You made me happier than I ever dreamed I could be." Rachel fought back tears. "You made me happy too, happier than I knew was possible." They sat there together under the stars, holding hands, 2 people who'd found each other by chance and built a life by choice, grateful for every season they'd shared. They made it home safely, and life continued its steady rhythm. Franklin's health stabilized, and while he wasn't as strong as he once was, he still had good days where he could work in the garden or do small repairs around the homestead. Rachel stayed active and healthy, and together, they continued to enjoy their quiet mountain life. In 1913, Henry and Grace had their first child, and in 1914, Thomas and Mary welcomed their 5th. Margaret and Peter had 6 children now, their youngest just 3 years old. The family gatherings were enormous, chaotic, and wonderful, with children running everywhere and multiple conversations happening at once. Franklin and Rachel presided over it all with quiet pride, pleased to see the legacy they'd created. As 1915 arrived, Franklin was 71 and Rachel was 65. They'd been married for 39 years, together for nearly 40. One evening in late spring, sitting on their porch watching the sunset, Rachel suddenly said, "Next year we'll have been married 40 years. "That's quite an achievement." 40 years, Franklin marveled. "Feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. Strange how that works." "We should do something special for our 40th, Rachel said. "Have all the children and grandchildren here, make it a real celebration." "Sounds perfect," Franklin agreed. "Though honestly, every day with you is a celebration," Rachel laughed. "You old romantic. After all these years, you still know how to make me blush." They spent that summer preparing for the anniversary celebration, planning and organizing despite their children insisting they should just relax and let everyone else handle it. But Franklin and Rachel wanted to be involved, wanted to help create this gathering that would bring their whole family together. As autumn arrived and their anniversary approached, preparations intensified. Thomas and his family arrived first, helping to set up extra sleeping spaces and prepare food. Then came Margaret with her brood, filling the homestead with noise and energy. Finally, Henry and Grace arrived from Helena with their young daughter. On the actual anniversary day in late April of 1916, 40 years since they'd married in Taylor's small church, Franklin and Rachel renewed their vows in front of their entire family. The local preacher came up the mountain for the occasion, and he spoke about the extraordinary example of love and commitment that Franklin and Rachel represented. When it was time for them to speak, Franklin held both of Rachel's hands and said, "40 years ago, I married the woman who saved my life. She literally pulled me back from the brink of giving up on everything good in the world. She brought me light, warmth, joy, purpose, and more love than any man deserves. She gave me a family and a real home, not just a cabin, but a true home filled with love. Rachel, you are everything to me. You always have been and you always will be. I love you more with each passing year." Rachel was crying openly by the time he finished. Through her tears, she said, "40 years ago, I married a man who showed me that strength and gentleness can exist together, that independence doesn't mean being alone, that love is choosing someone every single day. Franklin, you've been my warmth through every season, just like I knew you would be that first winter. You've kept me safe, loved me fiercely, supported my dreams, and built a beautiful life with me. Every good thing I have comes from choosing you. I love you with everything I am." There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering by the time they finished. Their children hugged them, the grandchildren clamored for attention, and the celebration that followed was full of food, music, laughter, and stories. That night, after everyone had settled down to sleep, Franklin and Rachel stood on their porch one more time, looking out at the moonlit mountain. "Thank you," Rachel said softly. "For what?" Franklin asked. "For 40 years of love, for being exactly who you are, for never giving up on us, even when things were hard, for giving me this extraordinary life." Franklin pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder the way she'd done thousands of times before. "Thank you for knocking on my door that night," he said. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for everything, Rachel." They stood there together under the stars, two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and built something lasting, surrounded by the family they'd created and the love they'd nurtured through 40 years and countless seasons. The mountains stretched out around them, wild and beautiful and home, and they were content. Franklin passed away peacefully in his sleep in the autumn of 1918 at the age of 74. He'd lived 2 years beyond their 40th anniversary. 2 good years full of love and family and the quiet contentment he'd found in his mountain home. Rachel was devastated by the loss, but she took comfort in knowing he'd died happy, surrounded by the life they'd built together. She stayed on the mountain for another 8 years, cared for by her children who made sure she was never alone for long. She continued to garden and sew and spend time with her grandchildren, and she often sat on the porch telling them stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive. Rachel passed away in the spring of 1926, at the age of 76, joining Franklin in the small cemetery near their cabin where they'd buried him. Their children buried them side by side, under a tree they'd planted together decades before, marking their graves with a simple stone that read, "Franklin and Rachel Thorne, together through every season, The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, a testament to the love story that had begun with a desperate knock on a cold winter night, and the warmth that had lasted through every season that followed.